Creationists who accept the biblical flood as being literally true must believe that every animal alive today is a descendant of an animal that was on the ark. Furthermore, every plant must have drowned in the flood, and all those alive today are descendants of seeds which floated on the floodwaters. If this were so, we would find much less genetic diversity among the populations of animals. We have an example of a species bottlenecking in the recent past. The cheetah population was reduced to as few as 70 animals approximately 10,000 years ago, and because of extensive inbreeding in such a small population, every living cheetah is almost exactly the same genetically. They have no heterozygosity, meaning the genes inherited from both parents are the same, and no polymorphism, such as different blood types or colorations. Human enzymes are approximately 70% similar, whereas cheetah enzymes are 97% similar. This is comparable to lab rats which have been inbred with brother and sister breeding for at least 20 generations. If this is the case for a population which was reduced to 70 animals 10,000 years ago, why do we not find this in every species if they were reduced to 2 or at most 7 animals 4,000 years ago? Kent Hovind and Answers in Genesis attempt to reconcile the size of the ark with the number of animals required to be carried on it by claiming that Noah merely took 2 of every kind, and that these branched into individual species. They have never provided a mechanism by which this type of evolution would occur, as natural selection requires large timescales for genetic mutations to accumulate in a population. If God was responsible for speciation, why could he not simply make animals from scratch after the flood? Why did he need them to be carried on the ark? Speciation requires a natural explanation. Furthermore, we have artistic depictions and scientific descriptions of animals from a variety of civilizations shortly after the flood was supposed to have occurred. If Hovind is right, all speciation must have occurred within roughly 500 years. This would require the old creationist mantra of a fish giving birth to a duck to be true. Otherwise, the animals would have to begin procreating immediately after being born in order to produce enough generations in this time period. We should also expect to find the same ridiculous amount of speciation occurring today. Creationists have never addressed this, or why speciation would have started and stopped so abruptly. Hovind also points to dogs and wolves as having come from the same kind. The problem with this is that dogs are a subspecies of wolves, not a separate species. If these populations, which have been isolated for approximately 15,000 years, have not become different species, how could different species of deer living in close proximity have done so in 4,000 years? Creationists also have no logical explanation for how land animals would have populated the Americas, Australia, and isolated islands, or why animals are spread across isolated ranges but found nowhere in between. I have never heard a creationist even attempt to explain the latter, and the answers proposed for the former are simply ridiculous. No matter the hypothesis, we must assume that immediately after disembarking the ark, the animals purposely set out for their habitats. This indicates a level of rationality and knowledge of geography not found in animals, and requires that animals were not subject to hunger or hyperthermia. Herbivores would have found no plants for some time after the floodwaters receded, nor would animals with specialized diets have found the necessary foods in the Middle East. Carnivores would have been unable to eat without causing an entire kind to go extinct by eating one of the 2 breeding members. The hypothesis proposed by the Creation Museum for animal dispersion is that driftwood from drowned forests formed a mat on the ocean, creating a bridge for animals to cross to distant continents. Let's ignore the fact that in this depiction the circulation of the ocean's currents are all in the wrong direction with the exception of the North Pacific. And let's ignore that forests only cover 9.4% of the Earth's surface, while ocean covers 72%, and all the trees couldn't cover this. And let's ignore that drowned trees are often held in place by their root systems. It's extremely difficult to stand on a log floating even in calm water, and much more so when 4 points of contact are required and the log is rolling on waves in the open ocean. There would also be no food source for these animals to eat during the crossing. The example used by the Creation Museum is the giant tortoise, which lives in the Galapagos, Madagascar, and the islands around it, and Indonesia. That it's found nowhere in between is claimed to be a failing of the scientific explanation. Let's examine the example using the museum's explanation, again ignoring the fact that the tortoises living in different locations are different species. According to the Creation Museum's assumption, the tortoises crossed the deserts of the Middle East and North Africa, and the jungles and rivers of Central Africa, knowing exactly where they were going. Upon reaching the coast, they divided into 2 populations, one crossing the width of Africa and boarding the Indian Ocean logmat, and the other boarding the Atlantic logmat. How the tortoises managed to get on them through crashing waves carrying driftwood to the beach is beyond me. The tortoises on the Indian Ocean mat would have had to cross the width of the ocean to reach Indonesia, and then recross it to reach Madagascar, as the current flows down the African coast away from the islands. The population on the Atlantic mat had to cross the width of the ocean, the Amazon jungle, and the Andes. They would then have had to board the Pacific mat to cross to the Galapagos, and of course they left no tortoises anywhere in between. Animals are not the only problem for creationists. Their hypothesis that plants survive by seeds floating on top of the water is clearly flawed by the simple fact that not every type of seed floats, nor do many types of plants, fungi, and lichen produce seeds, yet these are not extinct. Even more damning is the existence of plants which have been alive since before the Bible claims the flood occurred. A bristlecone pine cut down in 1964 was determined to be 5,000 years old using dendrochronology, which Hovind has accepted as a legitimate dating method. Another bristlecone pine still alive today is 4,840 years old. Furthermore, several clonal trees, which share root systems, have been found to be 3, 10, 80, and even 100,000 years old. Humans too pose a problem for creationists, and not just because of the genetic diversity we should lack. Human settlements have been found from more than 10,000 years ago, and we have 4 distinct civilizations dating back from before the flood. These civilizations had organized writing systems and continuous historical records which make no mention of the flood. If the populations of these civilizations were entirely wiped out, Noah's descendants would have had to immediately take up residence in them, adopting their languages, cultures, religions, and writing styles. How Noah's sons produced enough offspring to populate the entire planet immediately after the flood, and why these different populations are physically and genetically different, has never been explained. Nor has the presence of humans in the Americas. The Olmec civilization was well established in what is now Mexico by 1400 BC. That gives approximately 600 years to migrate from the Middle East, across Asia, including the Himalayas, and through North America. This is possible, assuming the people making the journey knew exactly where they were going, never had to stop for food, and had some method of crossing the Bering Strait. Hunter-gatherers spend an enormous amount of time finding food, significantly slowing the rate of migration. New environments require adaptation, with time to make appropriate clothing, find water sources, and learn the patterns of animals' behavior. Bedouins taken to the Arctic would be unable to survive, as the skills used by the Inuit take decades to master and require someone with prior knowledge to teach them. A group migrating from the Middle East could not possibly figure out the techniques needed to live in Siberia and Alaska within 600 years. Of course, a large portion of that 600 years would have been taken up just by producing enough people to make the journey. There is no possible way the Earth was completely covered in water 4,000 years ago.